Hi there and welcome to the Explaining History YouTube channel, and in this little video I'm going to talk about the links between the 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence. And the 7 Years' War, if we understand it, is a powerful cause of the American War of Independence. Okay, firstly about the 7 Years' War. Okay, so the 7 Years' War is fought in Europe, it's fought in India, it's fought in part on the high seas, and it's fought for, as far as Britain's concerned, in the Americas primarily. Britain fights as part of a coalition against the French in Europe, but it is just one of a succession of wars that last throughout the entirety of the 18th century. All the way up to the beginnings of the Napoleonic Wars, which obviously end in 1815. And these wars that really pit Britain and France primarily against one another throughout the 18th century are described as the Second 100 Years' War. Obviously, the first 100 Years' War dominates the 15th century and involves, Henry V and all that kind of thing, Agincourt and all that. But so this is a second 100 Years' War, and it's not a continuous war. It's a series of wars and truces. And why are they being fought? Well, primarily they're being fought because France and Great Britain and Spain and another number of other European powers have realised really that their futures are as colonial powers, that the wealth that is pouring into Europe, particularly into Northern Europe, into places such as Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the Holy Roman Empire via the Hanseatic ports. This wealth is born of trade. Now, you always do better in trade if you control the parts of the world that you're trading with. You essentially have a monopoly, a trading monopoly on colonies. And so the struggle for colonies was the struggle for wealth, the ability to have large flows of money coming into your country, very healthy tax revenues, and the ability, once again, to pay for large armies and navies in order to police your colonies. So the colonies generated money, but they also cost money as well. Now, between 1756 and 1763, the wars for really for the fate of the Americas are being fought all the way up the east coast of America, from the 13 colonies, or the original 13 colonies, from Georgia to Massachusetts, into Canada and French Canada, which was known as Quebec and still is. So the British originally don't do very well. The Indians, the Native American peoples, side with France. France is much better at dealing with their Native American subjects, and the Native American subjects aren't as routinely flung off their land as they are when the British are around. This is primarily, it's not necessarily because the French are nicer and more benign. In general, most colonising powers aren't nice and benign. They tend to do all manner of horrible things to their subjugated peoples. It's because the French populations in Canada, in Quebec, are smaller. There are fewer people, and there's less military might to be arraigned against the Native American peoples, and so instead of coercing them, you have to try to play a little bit more fairly with them. Still meant that there was a flow of wealth back to France, but the tribes of Canada and North America that are under the control of the French are more likely to work with them and prove effective scouts and trackers and fighters against the British. When William Pitt, the new Prime Minister, discovers that if the French are defeated in the Americas, that not only the Americas but also India and territories beyond could fall into British hands, he has something of a revelation. He sees a grand vision for a British Empire. And the victory over France in the 7 Years' War is a huge step forward towards building a British Empire. Now, the thing is that when the war is won in 1763, there is a large bill to pay. The colonists in the 13 colonies in America, they don't regard it as their job to pay the bill. Now, this isn't uniform. There are some colonists who are loyalists who believe that the connection with the Crown of England is the most important thing. But there is a large body of public opinion that thinks that this has been Britain's war and Britain should pay for it. Britain has been fighting in places other than America. There are American colonists who say, well, why should we pick up Britain's bill for fighting in India? What has that to do with us? In fact, were these colonies not born on the idea that we were autonomous, independent from the arbitrary rule from London? Originally, the colonists who'd come over in the 17th century and in the late 16th century had come over because they wished to avoid James I and Charles I's religious laws and principles, and they wished to have religious freedom. But now a generation of colonists, their grandchildren and in some cases great-grandchildren, thought that they deserved to be independent of the arbitrary power of Westminster to tax. And they also said, well, we don't have members of Parliament in Westminster. It's a hell of a long way to go. We can't sail to Westminster, and we can't sail members to Westminster and have seats there. So, we're not represented. So why should we pay taxation? It's not that they were completely reluctant to pay all taxation, but particularly taxation that was levied by London and taxation that seemed to be have a role in supporting the costs of empire. These were resented. The British turned around and said, well, hold on a moment. The monies that we raise go on administering the colonies and protecting them. They have protected you from rule by the French. And also, when colonists expand and try to sort of expand eastwards, as sometimes they do, what do? They run into Native American tribes, wars begin, and it is the British Army that has to intervene to protect colonists. So it all costs money, is the answer. The dispute kind of radicalises in 1773, a decade after the end of the 7 Years' War. And in that decade, there had been the key issue that had caused more trouble than anything else was the issue of customs. So these are the taxes that are put on bare essentials, things like sugar, tea, coffee, flour, things that are shipped into the colonies, many of them luxuries to make life a little bit more pleasant. Many of these commodities came from places like India, other parts of the growing British Empire. And in 1773, the East India Trading Company is given a monopoly on the trade of tea into the colonies. This meant that they could control the price. And it meant that that an American or a colonial tea company could not establish itself. The reason why the British government chose to give the East India Trading Company this right is that the East India Trading Company effectively controlled Eastern India for the British, centred at Calcutta and dominating eventually places such as Bengal. They had fought for the British during the 7 Years' War and raised an awful lot of revenue in order to pay for Indian mercenaries to fight Britain's wars in India, and the result had been that the East India Trading Company had managed to secure India for the British, and the French had been forced out with only a small concession in their colonial outpost at Pondicherry. the French were defeated in India, but it had cost the East India Trading Company an awful lot of money. So the British Empire, in order to keep the East India Trading Company viable and thus to control India, propped up the company by allowing it to monopolise the trade of tea across the rest of the empire. This was something that was hugely resented, and it directly leads to the Boston Tea Party, where the protesters, led by Samuel Adams, pour tea into the harbour from 3 tea ships sailing from Great Britain. Okay, I hope that's been useful. It's a very, very quick overview for my year 7, 8 and 9 pupils. And if you find that useful and you'd like more quick overviews of the history we're studying, subscribe to this channel, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History YouTube video. Thank you.